watching our hit new series VG release list, and you really should, it's great, then you'll know that last week saw the release of Mega Man Legacy Collection 2. 4 games from the Don't You Think He Looks Tired era of the Mega Man series, which die-hard fans will probably wind up buying anyway because, you know, it's not like they're getting a new Mega Man game anytime soon, and the last time someone tried to knock something out in that particular wheelhouse, it didn't turn out so well. So Mega Man fans will quite happily take what they can get, even if what they can get winds up being a collection of games they've already bought 4 times previously.
I say all that like I didn't pre-order it. I did. Twice.
The first Legacy Collection contains the 6 Mega Man games that people actually like, running in a proprietary emulator designed by Digital Eclipse, who, largely unrelated, ruined Mortal Kombat 4 on the Game Boy Color.
Of course, that was a long time ago, and they're generally lauded for their port work these days. It still hurts, damn it.
The second Legacy Collection, meanwhile, has been developed in-house by Capcom and contains brand spanking new ports of Mega Man 7, 8, 9, and 10. Those last 2 games were originally released for the PS3, 360, and the Wii, and were largely designed with ease of portability in mind, so porting them was, from a technical standpoint, probably a doddle.
Unless it wasn't, I don't know.
Meanwhile, Mega Man 7 was a Super Nintendo exclusive, and while emulating the Super Nintendo isn't especially difficult, you're probably emulating a Super Nintendo right now without even realizing it. Mega Man 8 was released for the PS1 and the Saturn, which are much trickier systems to reproduce, and Capcom probably reasoned that if they're going to go to the trouble of reporting one of them, they may as well do them both, which means that Mega Man 7 and 8 get brand spanking new ports.
This isn't the first time Capcom have done this with a Mega Man anthology, though. It isn't even the second time. It's the 4th.
The first attempt was Mega Man the Wily Wars for the Sega Genesis, which aimed to give the first 3 Mega Man games the Super Mario All-Stars treatment, bumping up the visuals, giving the music a fresh coat of paint, and throwing in an entirely unnecessary time travel story to justify having to replay these 3 games on another platform. Okay, alright. If you haven't heard of this one, don't be surprised. It only saw a retail release in Europe, Australia, and Japan, and never received a retail release in the US, instead being transmitted via Sega Channel, a sort of proto-broadband service specifically for the Genesis that lets Sega transmit games to subscribers' consoles. So be wary of any US copies of the Wily Wars you see floating around on eBay. They're probably fake.
The Sega Channel was a fascinating piece of kit, but as with most add-ons for the Sega Genesis, it wasn't as popular as Sega would have liked and didn't last very long as a result. I'd love to make a joke about Sega's failures here, but they beat me to it when they made the Sega Saturn.
The Wily Wars scores big points for putting 3 great Mega Mans. For putting these games on a system they were previously unavailable for, and for including an additional challenge, the Wily Tower, accessible once all 3 games have been completed. Sadly, it loses points for not quite being entirely faithful to the originals, with the most notable change being the rate of fire for Mega Man Shooty Gun, which has been drastically reduced. Fortunately, we got a significantly more faithful recreation of the original games with Capcom's next attempt at an anthology, Mega Man Anniversary Collection. Released in 2004 for the PS2 and GameCube, and in 2005 for the original Xbox. This time Capcom slapped the first 8 Mega Man games onto one disc, and as with Legacy Collection 2, these are in fact ports rather than emulations as is commonly believed. Of course, die-hard fans know that these weren't fresh ports, but were in fact ports of the Rockman Complete Works, a set of surprisingly faithful ports of the first 6 Mega Man games, put out exclusively in Japan for the PS1 between August and December of 1999. There's no emulation going on here, which is great because that allowed Capcom to add a ton of new features, including new power-ups, an optional remixed soundtrack, and Navi mode, which gives in-game hints and replaces the NES-style HUD with the one from Mega Man 8. There's even a minigame called Pokiroku which you can play on the Pocket Station that grants bonuses in-game. These are all great new features, and you'll be delighted to hear that all of them made the jump to the Anniversary Collection, with the exception of, in fact, most of them. The Pocket Station stuff got cut, because of course it did, which means the new in-game bonuses, which would have been useful, also got cut. Don't worry though, because the remixed soundtrack is still here, provided you're not playing the GameCube version, that is, because the developers couldn't fit all the music onto the disc. But that's okay, because GameCube players get their own special feature, a super weird and confusing controller configuration.
See, the NES version has you press A to jump and B to fire your shooty gun, whereas the GameCube version switches those buttons around, having you press B to jump and A to fire your gun. It's a small change, but it can really trip you up, even if you've been playing this game for, I don't know, let me just pick a number arbitrarily, 12 years.
If I had to speculate, and I do, I'd say that's because of the button configuration in the Rockman Complete Works, where fire is mapped to the X button while jump is mapped to square. This controller setup was carried over to Mega Man Anniversary Collection, so when they went to port this to the GameCube, they just transposed the controls to the GameCube controller in a more or less linear fashion, which would make sense if the button layout for the Cube's pad were a little more traditional as opposed to looking like expired llama beans haphazardly tossed over a mutated aubergine. Consequently, the controls are the only thing that can properly trip you up in what are otherwise fairly faithful ports of the Mega Man series, and you can bypass the controller woes by picking up the game for the PS2 or the Xbox. In fact, the Xbox version lets you customize the button configuration, so you can have whatever button do whatever you want. Oh, and did I mention that all 3 versions let you quickly switch between power-ups using the shoulder buttons? Take that, decidedly more faithful Legacy Collection! But besides all that, this is a set of some surprisingly faithful ports, and the collection even includes the 2 arcade games, Mega Man Power Battle and Mega Man 2, The Power Fighters, which had previously not seen home releases outside of Japan. Sure, you have to unlock them, which, you know, that's tedious, but they're there, and they're awesome.
The only disappointments in this collection are the ending to Mega Man 7, which utilizes the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 effect that apparently couldn't be properly reproduced on the modern systems for reasons, and the omission of the extra content from the Sega Saturn version of Mega Man 8, but that's also missing from Legacy Collection 2, so I don't know what you were expecting. I do know this though, a lot of people do not like Mega Man Anniversary Collection. Like a lot of people, a lot.
The general consensus these days seems to be that the Anniversary Collection is a terrible release, rife with sound issues, controller lag, and poor picture quality. And yes, there are some sound issues, the controls are backwards on the GameCube version, and the games have to be accessed using the most infuriating menu this side of the N64 version of Worms Armageddon, but the ports themselves are actually pretty decent. It's a solid collection of 10 great games that have held up fairly well, and importantly, neither Capcom nor developers Atomic Planet Entertainment managed to cock it up too badly. Hell, I even went back and looked at the Metacritic scores for this game, and it has an average of 80%, with mostly positive reviews and only 2 or 3 mixed reviews. There isn't a single negative review for the Anniversary Collection, so why is it so hated among Mega Man fans? Why the scorn? It reminds me of Red Dwarf Back to Earth, a revival of the British sci-fi comedy series that was acclaimed by critics and audiences alike when it first aired in 2009, but is the subject of ridicule whenever Red Dwarf is discussed in the media today.
Also Avatar, I suppose.
To an extent, I think that's due to people going back and revisiting this collection today and finding that it doesn't meet their expectations. But of course it doesn't. It's been almost a decade and a half. Things have moved on significantly since the release of Anniversary Collection, and you can't hold it to today's standards. One complaint I frequently see online today about Anniversary Collection is that it's fuzzy and blurry, and yeah, I suppose it would be if you're playing it on a modern flat screen telly as opposed to an old tube set. But I had this collection back in 2004, and you want to know what it looked like on an old tube television? It looked like sodding Mega Man.
Maybe if people were capable of putting their prejudices aside for a minute and just accepting a game for what it was when it was released instead of what they expect it to be almost a decade and a half later, maybe more people would enjoy themselves rather than getting angry over imagined slights.
But forget all that, because in the middle of this there is a forgotten title, a lost title. See, Capcom had also planned to release a compilation for the Game Boy Advance, originally called Mega Man Mania but later renamed Mega Man Anniversary Collection, that would have collected the 5 Game Boy Mega Man titles into one release, with updated, colorized graphics. The compilation was ultimately canned, and the reasons for this were never made clear. Some say Capcom lost the original source code for the 5 Game Boy games, while others attribute the release of the Nintendo DS and Nintendo's shift away from the Game Boy Advance to the aborted release. We may never know what happened with this compilation, only that it was never released.
We can only imagine what that collection would have been like. Let's do that now, together. That was nice. Good job.
And that is the last in the current series of PortsCenter. No, I'm joking, obviously. We'll be back next time with a look at Final Fantasy VI for the Game Boy Advance, and then we have episodes coming up on Daikatana and Street Fighter 2. So I will see you off in the future. Or I won't. I hope you come back, but I don't get to tell you how to live your life. Bye!